Think about the first 5 minutes of your morning. Not the ideal version, the real one. The alarm goes off, or your eyes open on their own, and before you have said a single word to another person, before the coffee is made, before the day has asked anything of you, something is already happening inside your mind, a mood settling in, a familiar feeling taking its position, a quiet inner voice beginning its daily broadcast. And most of the time, you did not choose what it says. It was just there, already running, like a program that starts the moment you wake. For most people, that first internal broadcast of the morning is a recycled version of yesterday's worry, or last night's unresolved tension, or a low-grade anxiety about the day ahead that feels so ordinary it barely registers as a choice. It just feels like reality, like the honest assessment of things as they are. But Napoleon Hill spent decades arguing quietly, insistently, and with mounting evidence that those first moments of the morning are not a passive experience. They are the most fertile and most consequential minutes of your entire day. And what you deliberately plant in your mind during those minutes, through the practice he called autosuggestion, determines more about the trajectory of your life than almost any action you will take afterward. What does the very first thought of your morning usually sound like, and would you choose it if you knew you were choosing? Leave your honest answer in the comments. The conversation that starts there might be the most useful one you have today. There is a particular kind of morning heaviness that almost no one talks about openly because it seems too small, too ordinary, too unglamorous to name. It is not depression, exactly. It is not crisis. It is the feeling of waking up already behind, already slightly defeated, already braced for a day that you expect to feel much like the last one. The alarm sounds, and before your feet hit the floor, some part of you has already assessed the situation and issued its verdict. Today will probably be more of the same. Napoleon Hill identified this invisible morning verdict as one of the most powerful and least examined forces in a human life. He believed that the mind, upon waking, exists in a state of unusual receptivity, what he called a condition of the mind that is especially open to impression and suggestion. The barrier between the conscious and the subconscious is thinner in those first waking moments than at almost any other point in the day, which means that whatever enters the mind first with emotional force and clear intention lands with disproportionate depth. It does not merely pass through. It roots. Hill described autosuggestion as the agency of communication between the conscious and subconscious portions of the mind. He was not describing a technique for feeling better in the short term. He was describing a fundamental mechanism of how human beings are shaped by their own thinking and how that shaping can be redirected through deliberate, emotionally charged, morning-anchored practice. Autosuggestion, in Hill's framework, is not something you do occasionally when you remember. It is something you do at the beginning of every day before the noise of the world comes in, because that is when the door to your deepest programming is most fully open. Think of it like the first page of a book. Whatever is written at the top of that first page sets the tone, the register, the emotional key in which everything that follows is read. Your morning mind is that first page, and most people are writing on it by accident, letting anxiety, habit, or the residue of yesterday fill the space that deliberate thought could occupy. There was a woman I once heard described who had spent years feeling like her mornings were doing something to her rather than for her. She would wake already running, already ticking through the list, already calculating the gap between where she was and where she needed to be, already slightly tense in a way she couldn't name but couldn't shake. A mentor asked her, almost as an aside, what the first deliberate thought of her morning was. She paused for a long time. Then she admitted that there wasn't one. The morning just happened to her, and she responded to it. The mentor said, that is the whole problem, and it has a very simple solution. It took her 3 weeks of a consistent autosuggestion practice specific, felt placed deliberately at the first moment of waking before she noticed that the tone of her entire day had shifted. Not the circumstances, the tone. And the tone, over time, changed the circumstances. In today's world, the morning is one of the most contested spaces in modern life. Every app, every notification, every algorithm is designed to capture your attention the moment your eyes open. The phone on the nightstand is not neutral. It is a funnel, and the first thing it pours into your newly woken, uniquely receptive mind is usually someone else's agenda, breaking news, social comparison, the urgent pull of other people's priorities. Hill could not have anticipated the smartphone, but his warning maps onto it with unsettling precision. The person who hands the first moments of their morning to an algorithm has handed the most fertile minutes of their day to something that does not know them, does not care about them, and is optimized for their attention rather than their growth. The reframe is this: the morning is not something that happens to you. It is the first act of authorship available to you each day. And autosuggestion is the pen. So what would you write if you knew the first page set the tone for all the rest? Before we go further into what Hill's method actually looks like in practice, it is worth pausing on why the morning, specifically the morning, carries such unusual weight in his thinking. Because Hill was not simply saying that positive thoughts at any time of day are beneficial. He was making a much more particular claim about timing, and it is a claim that the science of the last several decades has quietly gone on to support. Hill believed that the subconscious mind is most accessible, most permeable to new instruction during two windows of the day, the period just before sleep and the period just after waking. He described these as transitional states, moments when the ordinary resistance of the conscious mind, its skepticism, its editorial function, its habit of filtering new information through the lens of established belief is temporarily relaxed. In those transitional moments, what you direct toward yourself bypasses the filter. It lands somewhere deeper than argument can reach. This is not metaphor. The science of sleep and cognition has identified the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the twilight zones at the edges of sleep, as periods of unusual neuroplasticity when the brain is laying down memory, consolidating pattern, and proving unusually receptive to suggestion and imagery. Hill wrote about this dynamic decades before the neuroscience existed to describe it, but the convergence is striking. He was pointing at something real. What this means practically is that the thought you plant in the first minutes of your morning is not just a thought, it is a seed placed in the most fertile soil of your entire day at the moment when the soil is most ready to receive it. The same thought placed at noon or at 3 in the afternoon when the analytical, resistant mind is fully awake and running will have a fraction of the rooting power of the same thought placed at the first moment of waking. Think of it like the difference between planting in spring and planting in a drought. The seed is identical. The conditions determine everything. There was a man I once heard about who had been trying for years to build a different relationship with his own sense of capability. He had the skills, he had the experience, but there was something in him, a hesitation, a quiet inner voice that said, wait, be careful, you will probably fall short, that kept arriving before action and often stopping it. He had tried to argue with the voice, to reason it down, to overcome it through force of will. Nothing worked because the voice was not a product of reasoning. It lived below reasoning in the pattern space of the subconscious where logic cannot reach. When he began placing a specific felt autosuggestion at the very first moment of waking, before the phone, before the coffee, before the day made its demands, he was reaching the voice at the level where it actually lived. Gradually, month by month, a different voice began to take up more space. not louder, just more present, more consistent, more like the truth. The modern morning routine industry has grown enormous. There are books and podcasts and entire philosophies built around the first hour of the day. Most of them are oriented around action, exercise, journaling, cold exposure, reading. All of those practices have value. But Hill's insight sits beneath all of them, more fundamental than any behavior, because what you do with your body in the morning matters. But what you plant in your mind in the first moments of waking matters more. The body follows the mind, always. The invitation is quiet but consequential. Before the routine begins, tomorrow morning, before the action, before the to-do list, before the phone, what if you gave the first 2 minutes to something deliberate, something felt, something chosen? Now we arrive at the practical heart of what Hill actually taught. And this is where the most important distinctions live. Because autosuggestion, as Hill described it, is not simply the repetition of positive statements. The method has a specific structure, and each element of that structure is there for a reason. Miss one piece, and the practice tends to produce the lukewarm, unconvincing results that cause most people to quietly abandon it. The first element is specificity. Hill was insistent on this point. He described the need for a clear, precise, detailed mental image of the outcome being sought. Not, I want to be more confident or I want to feel better, but a specific, concrete, fully imagined picture of the state or achievement being pursued. The subconscious mind, in Hill's framework, does not navigate toward abstractions. It navigates toward targets. And a target that has been painted in vivid, specific detail is a target the deeper intelligence can actually work toward. The second element, the one most people minimize, is emotion. Hill believed and wrote clearly that the subconscious mind is moved not by words but by feelings. A statement repeated flatly without genuine emotional engagement is like a letter sent without postage. The form is correct, but it does not arrive. The feeling is what delivers the instruction to the part of the mind that can actually act on it. Desire, faith, enthusiasm, these were not soft additions to Hill's method. They were the mechanism. The third element is repetition. Not frantic, anxious repetition, but calm, consistent, daily practice the way a musician runs scales. Not because scales are the music, but because scales are how the hands learn what the music eventually needs them to do. Hill described autosuggestion as a process of conditioning, and conditioning requires time, patience, and regularity that a culture of instant results consistently underestimates. And the fourth element, perhaps the subtlest, is surrender. After the morning practice, Hill suggested releasing the instruction, not holding on, not checking obsessively for results, not trying to manage with the conscious mind what has been handed to the subconscious. The trust implied in that release is itself part of the practice. The anxious grip of the conscious mind interferes with the quieter, deeper work of the subconscious. Planting and immediately digging up to check the roots does not produce a garden. There was a woman I once heard described who had tried every version of a morning practice available: journaling, meditation, gratitude lists, affirmations, and had found each one helpful for a few weeks before the habit faded. When she finally worked with Hill's method in its complete form, specific image, genuine emotion, consistent repetition, and the discipline to release it afterward rather than obsessing the experience, was qualitatively different from anything she had tried before. The difference, she said, was that for the first time, the practice felt real rather than performed, like she was actually communicating with something rather than just going through motions. The results that followed were not dramatic or sudden, but they were steady. And steady, she eventually understood, is what actually changes a life. If something in this is landing, If you are beginning to see why a practice you may have tried hasn't worked the way you hoped, then this moment of clarity is worth something. Something specific. Share this with someone you know who has tried this kind of inner work and quietly given up on it. Not to convince them of anything, just because sometimes the right explanation, arriving at the right moment, is the thing that turns a failed attempt into a real beginning. There is a question that runs underneath everything Hill taught about the morning autosuggestion practice, and it is the one most worth sitting with. Why does it have to be a thought you plant? Why not simply choose better actions, make better decisions, build better habits at the behavioral level? Isn't that more practical, more measurable, more real? Hill's answer to that question was patient and consistent across everything he wrote. Because the thought comes first, always. Without exception, every action that a human being takes is preceded by a thought. Often a thought so fast and so automatic that it feels like instinct rather than decision. The habit that seems behavioral is underneath a thought pattern that has become so well worn that it runs without conscious awareness. The decision that seems rational is at its root shaped by an underlying belief about what is possible and what is deserved. You cannot reliably change behavior without changing the inner world that generates it, and you cannot change the inner world through behavior alone. Hill believed that most people have it exactly backward. They try to act their way into a new way of thinking when what is actually required is to think deliberately, emotionally, consistently their way into a new way of acting. Autosuggestion is the method by which the thinking is done. The morning is the time at which it is most potent. And the gap between the life you are living and the life you are capable of is, in Hill's view, largely the gap between the thoughts you are allowing and the thoughts you are deliberately planting. Think of it like the difference between watering whatever happens to grow in a garden and intentionally cultivating what you want to harvest. Both gardens will grow something. Neglected soil still produces weeds, are extraordinarily efficient. But the person who waters what they want, who tends what they have chosen, who returns each morning to the same deliberate act of cultivation, that person gets to choose the harvest. There was a man I once read about who had spent the better part of a decade in a professional life he found progressively draining. He was competent, even respected, but the work felt misaligned with something deeper in him, and the feeling of misalignment had become so familiar that he had started to think of it as simply who he was, a person whose inner life and outer life did not quite match. He could not immediately change the outer circumstances, but he could change the first thought of his morning. He began planting each day before rising the clear felt image of the work he was actually made for, not as escapism, but as instruction to the subconscious. What followed was not a miraculous sudden change. It was a gradual series of small recognitions, small actions, small pivots, each one unremarkable in isolation that over 18 months moved him almost without his noticing into a completely different chapter of his professional life. The subconscious, faithfully instructed, had simply been finding the path one step at a time. This is where autosuggestion becomes something more than a morning ritual. It becomes a navigational system, a way of keeping your deeper intelligence oriented toward the life you are building, even when the surface of things looks unchanged, even when the harvest is not yet visible. The question to sit with today is simple and important. What are you currently cultivating? And is it what you want to harvest? One of the most powerful things Hill ever observed about the morning autosuggestion practice, and one of the things most casually overlooked, is that it works not by changing the world, but by changing the perceiver. And that distinction contains everything. When you plant a specific emotionally charged thought at the beginning of each day through consistent autosuggestion, you are not casting a wish into the universe and waiting for it to be granted. You are recalibrating the instrument through which you experience and respond to everything that happens. You are, in a quite literal sense, changing what you notice, what you are drawn to, what you have the confidence to reach for, and what you allow yourself to believe is available to you. The world does not change. The you that moves through the world changes. And a changed perceiver in an unchanged world is functionally in a different world. Hill described this dynamic in the context of what he called the power of the master mind, the principle that mental and spiritual resources multiply when directed with clarity and purpose. In the individual practice of morning autosuggestion, the same principle applies. The person who begins each day with a clear, felt, repeated inner directive is not simply feeling better. They are operating with a kind of coherence, a mind pointing consistently in one direction that the scattered, reactive, defaulting mind simply cannot match over the long course of a life. There was a young woman I once heard about who had always assumed that the people who seemed to move through life with a certain ease and confidence were simply built that way. Born with it, lucky in some quiet way she had not been. She had never considered that the ease might be a practice, that the confidence might be something planted repeatedly, deliberately over years of morning discipline until it simply became who a person was. When she began her own morning autosuggestion practice, the thing that surprised her most was not the outer results. It was the gradual sense of inner consistency of waking up and finding more mornings than not that there was something oriented and steady in her before the day began. Like a compass that had been calibrated and trusted to point true. In a world that moves faster than it ever has, that creates more noise and more distraction and more anxiety than any previous generation has had to navigate, the morning moments of deliberate inner orientation are not a luxury. They are, in Hill's framework, the foundation, the inner infrastructure on which everything else is built. Without them, the rest of the morning routine, however disciplined and impressive, is, as Hill might have put it, building the house without first laying the foundation. If this conversation is opening something for you, if the idea of a morning practice grounded in Hill's actual method feels like something worth taking seriously rather than something you have already tried and found wanting, consider this a beginning rather than a reminder. And if there is someone in your world who would benefit from hearing this, someone who is searching for the thing that makes the other practices finally work, this might be the most useful thing you could pass along today. And so we return to where we began, to the alarm, to the first waking moment, to the morning that either happens to you or begins with a deliberate choice. We open by asking what is already running in those first minutes before the day makes its demands. And the answer, for most people, is whatever has always run the accumulated pattern of thought, expectation, and quiet belief that was installed by experience and never consciously examined. Hill's method, autosuggestion, planted at the morning's threshold, specific and felt and consistent, is the answer to that. Not a dramatic answer, a patient one. The kind that does not announce itself, but simply over weeks and months of faithful practice, shifts the inner weather in ways that the outer life cannot help but eventually reflect. But here is the profound reversal we're sitting with as we close. You have probably been thinking of this practice as something you add to your morning, a new discipline, a new habit, a new thing to do before the day begins. And that framing, while understandable, slightly misses the point. The truth is that you are already planting something in your mind every morning without exception, without interruption, without anyone's permission. The question has never been whether you practice autosuggestion. The question is only whether you practice it consciously, whether you choose the thought that goes in first, or whether you let yesterday choose it for you. Napoleon Hill's warning and his invitation are the same thing, spoken from different angles. The mind is always listening. The morning is always writing its first page. And the only thing that stands between the thought you are currently planting and the thought that could change the arc of your life is the decision to plant deliberately, beginning tomorrow morning, before the phone, before the noise, before the day arrives, to make its case. If continuing to explore these ideas, the deeper architecture of how the human mind builds a life, feels like the kind of journey we're staying on, the next conversation is already here. Not as a subscription to Click, but as a continuing chapter in the same story, the one where the first thought of the morning is no longer an accident, the one where you are finally and fully the author. Plant this thought every morning and let the rest follow.